Emma was 7 years old. She had bright blue eyes and long brown hair that her mother always put in two neat braids. Every Saturday morning, she would wake up early and run to her parents' bedroom. She would jump on their bed and ask the same question she asked every week: "Can we go see the palace today, please, please, please?" Her parents would laugh and shake their heads, but they always said yes. Emma loved going to Buckingham Palace more than anything else in the world. She loved it more than ice cream. She loved it more than her favorite cartoon shows. She even loved it more than Christmas morning. The walk to the palace took 30 minutes from their small apartment in London. Emma would skip along the sidewalk, holding her father's hand tightly. She would point at the red buses and black taxis that drove past them. She would wave at the people walking their dogs in the park. But all the time, she was thinking about the palace. When they finally reached the big iron gates, Emma's heart would beat faster. The palace was huge and beautiful. It had so many windows that Emma could never count them all. The walls were a soft gray color, and the roof was dark and pointed. Beautiful gardens surrounded the building with green grass and colorful flowers that changed with each season. But Emma was not most interested in the building itself. She was most interested in the guards. The palace guards wore bright red jackets with shiny gold buttons. They had tall, fuzzy black hats that looked like they were made from bear fur. Emma's grandmother had told her that these hats were called bearskin hats, and they were very special. The guards carried rifles and stood very, very still. They never moved, they never smiled. They never talked to anyone. Emma thought this was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. "How do they do it, Daddy?" she would ask her father every time they visited. "How do they stand so still for so long?" Her father would smile and ruffle her hair. "They are very well trained, sweetheart. They practice every day to be the best guards they can be." Emma would press her face against the cold iron bars of the gate and stare at the nearest guard. She would watch him for minutes at a time, looking for any sign that he might move. Sometimes she thought she saw his eyes blink, but she was never sure. Sometimes she thought she saw his chest move up and down when he breathed, but the movement was so small she might have imagined it. Other children who visited the palace would get bored after a few minutes. They would pull on their parents' arms and ask to go somewhere else. They wanted to see the toy shops or get some candy, but Emma never got bored. She could watch the guards for hours if her parents would let her. "What do you think they think about when they stand there?" she asked her mother one day. Her mother thought for a moment. Maybe they think about protecting the royal family. Maybe they think about their training. Maybe they think about their families at home. This made Emma wonder even more about the guards. Did they have children like her? Did they miss their families when they were working? Did they ever get tired or hungry or need to use the bathroom? Emma's grandmother had told her many stories about the palace guards. Grandmother said that these guards were some of the best soldiers in the whole world. They came from a special group called the Queen's Guard. They had to train for many months before they could work at the palace. They had to learn how to march in perfect lines. They had to learn how to stand still, no matter what happened around them. "No matter what?" Emma had asked with wide eyes. "No matter what," her grandmother had said with a serious nod. "Even if it rains, they must stand still. Even if people try to talk to them, they must not answer. Even if something funny happens, they must not laugh. They are like statues that can walk." This idea fascinated Emma. She began to think of the guards as magic people who could turn themselves into statues whenever they wanted. She imagined that when their workday was over, they would suddenly come alive again, like toys in a story she had read. Emma started to notice things that other people did not see. She noticed that the guards' eyes would move very slightly to watch people who came too close to the gates. She noticed that their hands gripped their rifles a little tighter when large crowds gathered. She noticed that they would sometimes shift their weight from one foot to the other, but so slowly that most people would not see it. She began to feel sorry for them. Standing still for such a long time must be very hard work. Their feet must hurt. Their backs must get sore. And they could never sit down or take a break while people were watching. Emma started bringing small things with her when she visited the palace. She would bring drawings she had made at school. She would bring flowers she had picked from her mother's garden. She would bring cookies her grandmother had baked. She could not give these things to the guards, because her parents told her she must not bother them while they were working. But she would hold up her drawing so the guards could see them, even though they never looked directly at her. One Saturday, Emma asked her parents a question that surprised them. "Do you think the guards ever get lonely?" Her parents looked at each other. They had never thought about this before. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" her father said. Emma pointed at the guard who stood nearest to where they were standing. "He has to stand there all by himself. He cannot talk to anyone. He cannot play with anyone. He just has to stand there and watch people look at him. That seems very lonely to me." Her mother knelt down, so she was the same height as Emma. "You have a very kind heart, Emma. I think you are right. It probably does get lonely sometimes." From that day on, Emma looked at the guards differently. She did not just see them as amazing statue people anymore. She saw them as real people who had a very difficult job. She began to smile at them more, even though they could not smile back. She began to wave at them gently, even though they could not wave back. Emma hoped that somehow, her smiles and waves would make them feel a little less lonely during their long hours of standing guard at the most important palace in England. 3 weeks later, Emma woke up to a very different kind of Saturday morning. When she looked out her bedroom window, she could barely see the building across the street. A thick, gray fog covered everything like a heavy blanket. The world looked mysterious and quiet. "Mommy, can we still go to the palace today?" Emma asked when she found her parents in the kitchen. Her mother looked out the window and frowned. "It is very foggy, Emma. We might not be able to see much." But Emma's father smiled and patted her head. "A little fog never hurt anyone. Let's go see how the palace looks on a foggy day." Emma clapped her hands with joy. She quickly ate her breakfast and put on her warmest coat. The fog made everything feel cold and damp, even inside their apartment. The walk to the palace was very different. That day, Emma could only see a few feet in front of her. The red buses and black taxis appeared suddenly out of the fog like ghosts, their headlights glowing in the gray air. The sound of their engines seemed louder than usual, but also more distant and mysterious. Emma held her father's hand extra tightly. She had never seen London look like this before. It felt like walking through a dream, or like being inside a cloud that had fallen down to earth. When they reached the palace, Emma gasped. The fog made everything look magical. The tall iron gates appeared and disappeared in the misty air. The palace building itself was almost completely hidden. Emma could only see the bottom part of the walls. The rest seemed to float away into the gray sky. "It looks like a fairy tale castle," Emma whispered to her mother. The fog also made the palace much quieter than usual. There were fewer tourists because many people had decided to stay home on such a foggy day. The small group of people who had come spoke in whispers, as if the fog had put a spell on everyone. Emma walked up to her usual spot at the iron gate. The guard who stood there looked even more mysterious in the fog. His red jacket was bright against the gray air, but his face was harder to see under his tall black hat. He stood perfectly still, just like always, but somehow the fog made him seem even more like a statue. Emma's parents stood behind her talking quietly about the weather. Her father was taking pictures with his camera, trying to capture how strange and beautiful everything looked. Her mother was reading a guidebook about the palace history. Emma was looking at the guard when something caught her eye. Near the bottom of the iron gate, where the metal bars met the stone ground, she saw a small splash of white against the dark, wet leaves that had fallen from the trees. She moved closer to get a better look. It was not a leaf or a piece of trash. It was an envelope. Emma looked around to see if anyone else had noticed it, but her parents were still busy with their camera and guidebook. The few other tourists were taking pictures of the palace through the fog. Nobody was paying attention to the ground near the gate. The envelope was small and cream-colored. Even though it had been lying in the damp leaves, it did not look old or dirty. It looked like it had been dropped very recently, maybe even that morning. Emma crouched down to look at it more carefully. She could see that there was writing on the front, but she could not read it well from where she stood. The handwriting looked very fancy and neat, like the writing on wedding invitations her mother sometimes received. She looked at the envelope for a long time, thinking about what she should do. Her parents had always taught her not to pick up things that did not belong to her. But they had also taught her to help people when they lost something important. This looked like it might be very important. The envelope was too nice to be just regular mail, and it was lying so close to the palace gates. Maybe someone who worked at the palace had dropped it. Maybe it contained something that the royal family needed to see. Emma looked at her parents again. They were now talking to another family about the best places to take pictures in the fog. They would probably be busy for several more minutes. She made a decision. Very carefully, Emma reached through the iron bars of the gate. She had to stretch her arm as far as she could to reach the envelope. Her fingers just barely touched it. She pulled it gently toward her until she could pick it up properly. The envelope felt expensive in her hands. The paper was thick and smooth, much nicer than the envelopes her family used for sending letters. There was a red wax seal on the back that had been pressed with some kind of design. Emma had never seen a real wax seal before except in movies about kings and queens. She turned the envelope over to look at the front. The writing was indeed very fancy. It was written with what looked like a fountain pen in dark blue ink. The Yai letters were perfectly formed, like someone had practiced writing them many times. Emma could read most of the words, but some of them were difficult. The envelope was addressed to someone at the palace, but the name was written in such fancy letters that Emma was not sure she was reading it correctly. The last name looked like it might be Pemberton, but Emma was not certain. What made Emma's heart beat faster was what she saw in the top corner of the envelope. There was a small coat of arms printed there. It looked very official and important. Emma had seen pictures of coat of arms in her books about castles and knights. This one had a crown at the top and what looked like lions on either side. Emma realized that this was not just any letter. This was something very special and very important. Someone who worked at the palace needed to get this letter. And somehow, it had ended up on the ground outside the gates. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Emma looked at the guard who stood just a few feet away from her. He had not moved at all while she was looking at the envelope. His eyes were looking straight ahead, just like always. But Emma noticed that his position gave him a perfect view of the exact spot where she had found the letter. Had he seen her pick it up? If he had, he was not showing any sign of it. His face was as calm and serious as always. Emma walked slowly toward the guard. Her heart was beating so fast, she was sure everyone around her could hear it. She had never tried to talk to one of the palace guards before. She was not even sure if she was allowed to. But this was important. The letter needed to get to its proper owner, and the guard was the person who could make sure that happened. Emma stopped just in front of the guard and looked up at his face. He was much taller than she had realized. From up close, she could see that he was probably not much older than her father. His red jacket had many shiny buttons and gold decorations that sparkled even in the foggy light. She held up the envelope so he could see it clearly. "Excuse me," Emma said in her politest voice. "I think someone dropped this letter. It was lying on the ground right over there. I think it might be for someone who works at the palace." For the first time in all the months Emma had been watching the palace guards, she was about to see one of them react to something she had done. Sergeant James Mitchell had been standing at his post for exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. He knew this because keeping track of time was part of his training. Every guard learned to count the minutes and hours without looking at a watch or clock. It helped them stay focused during the long periods of standing still. James had been a palace guard for 3 years. Before that, he had been a soldier in the British Army for 8 years. He was 29 years old, and he took his job very seriously. Protecting the royal family was not just his job, it was his honor and his duty. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time was not easy, but James had learned how to do it well. He had trained his body to stay in the same position without moving. He had trained his mind to stay alert while his body remained like a statue. He had learned to notice everything that happened around him without showing any reaction on his face. On this foggy Saturday morning, James was watching everything very carefully. The thick fog made his job more difficult. He could not see as far as usual. People appeared suddenly out of the gray mist and then disappeared just as quickly. This made him more alert than usual. James had noticed the little girl with the brown braids as soon as she arrived with her parents. He had seen her many times before. She came to the palace almost every Saturday morning, and she always spent a long time looking at the guards. James thought she was probably about 7 years old, maybe 8. Most children got bored quickly when they visited the palace. They would look at the guards for a few minutes, maybe try to make them laugh or move, and then ask their parents to go somewhere else. But this little girl was different. She would stand at the gate for a very long time just watching. She would smile at the guards and wave gently, but she never tried to bother them or make them break their concentration. James appreciated this. The little girl seemed to understand that the guards had an important job to do. She was respectful and quiet. Sometimes James even looked forward to seeing her on Saturday mornings, although he would never show this on his face. Today, James had been watching the little girl more carefully than usual because of the fog. Her parents were distracted, taking pictures and talking to other tourists. The girl was standing very close to the gate, and James wanted to make sure she stayed safe. That was when he saw her notice something on the ground. James watched as the little girl crouched down and looked at whatever she had found. He could see that it was some kind of white object lying in the fallen leaves, but the fog made it difficult to see exactly what it was. The girl looked around to see if anyone was watching her, then very carefully reached through the bars of the gate to pick up the object. James felt his muscles tense slightly. He was trained to notice when people did unexpected things near the palace. Picking up objects from the ground and reaching through the gate were both things that could be dangerous. But the little girl was so small and her movements were so careful that James was not really worried. He was more curious than concerned. When the girl stood up and turned the object over in her hands, James could see that it was an envelope. A white or cream-colored envelope that looked official and important. The girl studied it carefully for several minutes, and James could see her trying to read the writing on the front. James felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the foggy weather. In his 3 years as a palace guard, he had learned to recognize when something was not ordinary. He had been trained to notice details that other people might miss, and something about this envelope made him feel that this was not just a piece of ordinary mail that someone had accidentally dropped. The little girl was now walking toward him. James could see the envelope clearly in her small hands. His heart began to beat faster, although his face remained perfectly calm and still. "Excuse me," the little girl said in a polite voice. "I think someone dropped this letter. It was lying on the ground right over there. I think it might be for someone who works at the palace." James looked down at the envelope in the girl's hands, and immediately he knew that his feeling had been correct. This was not ordinary mail. The envelope was made of expensive cream-colored paper. It had a red wax seal on the back that looked official and important. But what made James's blood run cold was the writing on the front. Even upside down and from several feet away, he could read the name clearly. The envelope was addressed to Lady Catherine Pemberton. James had heard that name many times in the past 3 months. Lady Catherine Pemberton was a member of the royal household staff. She worked as a personal assistant to one of the minor members of the royal family. 3 months ago, she had suddenly stopped coming to work. She had not called in sick. She had not asked for time off. She had simply disappeared. James had been briefed about Lady Catherine's disappearance during several security meetings. The palace security team was concerned about what had happened to her. They were worried that she might have been kidnapped or hurt. They were also worried that she might have been involved in something dangerous or illegal. Her sudden disappearance had created many questions and very few answers. All of the palace guards had been given Lady Catherine's description and told to watch for her. They had been told to report immediately if they saw her or if anyone tried to contact the palace about her. The security team was treating her disappearance as a serious matter. And now, 3 months later, a 7-year-old girl was holding an envelope with Lady Catherine's name on it. James felt his training kick in. He needed to stay calm and not show any reaction that might alarm the little girl or her parents. But he also needed to get that envelope to the security team as quickly as possible. The little girl was still looking up at him, waiting for him to respond. Her blue eyes were serious and concerned. She clearly understood that the envelope was important, even though she probably did not understand exactly how important it was. James had a problem. Palace guards were not supposed to accept items from members of the public. It was a strict rule that was meant to protect both the guards and the royal family. People sometimes tried to give the guards messages, gifts, or other items that could be dangerous. The guards were trained to politely refuse anything that people tried to give them, but this situation was different. This envelope could be crucial evidence in a missing person case. It could contain information about what had happened to Lady Catherine. It could even contain clues about where she was now. James realized that he was about to make a decision. That could change everything. He could follow the rules and refuse to take the envelope, which would mean it might disappear again and never reach the security team. Or he could break the rules and accept it, which could get him in trouble but might also help solve the mystery of Lady Catherine's disappearance. James looked at the little girl's earnest face. She was trying to do the right thing by returning what she thought was a lost letter. She had no idea that she might be holding the key to solving one of the palace's biggest security concerns. For the first time in 3 years of being a palace guard, James felt his perfect composure beginning to crack. His hands, which had been holding his rifle in exactly the same position for over 2 hours, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The little girl continued to hold up the envelope, patiently waiting for him to take it. She trusted him to do the right thing. And James realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. James Mitchell's mind was racing, but his body remained perfectly still. Years of training had taught him to think quickly, while showing no emotion on his face. But inside his head, thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind. He looked down at the little girl again. She was still holding the envelope up toward him, her small arms beginning to get tired from holding them in the same position. Her parents were about 20 feet away, still busy with their cameras and talking to other tourists. They had not noticed what their daughter was doing. James studied the envelope more carefully. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, written with what looked like an expensive fountain pen. The ink was dark blue and the letters were perfectly formed. This was not the kind of writing that most people used for ordinary letters. This was the kind of writing used for very important documents. The red wax seal on the back of the envelope was what really caught James's attention. The seal bore a coat of arms that James recognized. It was not the royal coat of arms, but it was one that belonged to a noble family that had connections to the palace. James had seen this particular coat of arms many times during his security briefings. But the most important thing was the name on the front of the envelope. Lady Catherine Pemberton was written in beautiful script letters. Just seeing that name made James remember all the security meetings he had attended about her disappearance. Lady Catherine had worked at the palace for 15 years. She had started as a junior secretary and had worked her way up to become a personal assistant to Princess Margaret's cousin. She was known for being very reliable, very discreet, and very loyal to the royal family. She had never caused any problems or security concerns. That was why her sudden disappearance had been so shocking and worrying. Lady Catherine was not the kind of person who would just disappear without telling anyone. She was not the kind of person who would abandon her responsibilities. Something serious must have happened to make her leave so suddenly. James remembered the details from the security briefings. Lady Catherine had been at work on a Tuesday morning in June. She had attended her usual meetings and completed her normal tasks. But on Wednesday morning, she had not come to work. When her supervisor called her apartment, there was no answer. When security guards went to check on her, they found that she had left very quickly. Some of her clothes and personal items were gone, but most of her belongings were still there. Her car was found parked at King's Cross Station, one of London's busiest train stations. Security cameras showed her buying a train ticket, but the cameras could not see which train she had taken or where she had gone. After that, there was no trace of her anywhere. The palace security team had investigated every possibility they could think of. They had checked with her family and friends, but no one had heard from her. They had looked into her financial records and found that she had withdrawn a large amount of money from her bank account the day before she disappeared. They had searched her apartment and her office for clues, but had found nothing that explained why she had left so suddenly. Some people thought that Lady Catherine might have been threatened or blackmailed by someone. Others thought that she might have discovered something dangerous and had to hide to protect herself. A few people even thought that she might have been involved in something illegal and had run away to avoid getting caught. But no one knew for sure what had happened. Lady Catherine Pemberton had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and worried colleagues. And now, 3 months later, a letter with her name on it had appeared at the palace gates. James looked at the little girl again. She was starting to look worried. She probably thought that she had done something wrong by approaching him. Her arms were getting tired from holding up the envelope, and she was beginning to wonder why he was not taking it from her. James realized that he had to make a decision quickly. If he waited much longer, the girl's parents would notice what was happening and might interfere. If he followed normal protocol and refused to take the envelope, it might disappear again and never reach the people who needed to see it. But if he took the envelope, he would be breaking one of the most important rules that palace guards had to follow. He could get in serious trouble. He could lose his job. He could even be arrested if the envelope turned out to contain something dangerous. James thought about what Lady Catherine would want him to do. If she had somehow managed to get this letter to the palace, she must have wanted it to reach someone important. If she was in danger or in hiding, this letter might be her only way of communicating with people who could help her. James made his decision. Very slowly and carefully, he moved his eyes to look directly at the little girl. This was the first time in his 3 years as a palace guard that he had looked directly at a member of the public while on duty. It was against the rules, but James needed the girl to know that he was paying attention to her. The little girl's eyes widened with surprise when she saw the guard looking at her. For a moment, she forgot about the envelope and just stared back at him. She had been watching the palace guards for months, and this was the first time one of them had ever looked directly at her. James gave the tiniest possible nod of his head. The movement was so small that anyone watching from a distance would not have noticed it. But the little girl was standing close enough to see it clearly. The nod was James's way of telling the girl that he understood what she was trying to do, and that he appreciated her help. It was also his way of telling her that he was going to take the envelope from her. James slowly moved his left hand away from his rifle. This was another major break in protocol. Palace guards were supposed to keep both hands on their weapons at all times while on duty. But James needed one hand free to take the envelope. He extended his left hand toward the little girl, palm up. His movement was very slow and careful, so that anyone watching would think he was just adjusting his position slightly. The little girl understood immediately. Her face lit up with a big smile, and she quickly placed the envelope in James's outstretched, and the moment the envelope touched his palm, James felt a small shock run through his body. The paper felt strange, too light for what should be inside a normal letter. There was definitely something in the envelope besides just paper, but James could not tell what it was without looking more closely. James closed his fingers around the envelope and slowly moved his hand back to his side. He slipped the envelope into a small pocket on the inside of his red jacket, where it would be hidden from view. The little girl was beaming with happiness. She had successfully completed her mission of returning the lost letter. She gave James a small wave and whispered, "Thank you," before turning around and skipping back to her parents. James returned his left hand to his rifle and resumed his perfect guard position. To anyone watching from a distance, it would look like nothing had happened. But James knew that everything had just changed. He now had Lady Catherine Pemberton's letter hidden in his jacket pocket. He could feel it pressing against his ribs with every breath he took. In less than an hour, when his shift ended and the next guard came to replace him, James would have to decide what to do with the most important piece of evidence that had appeared in the Lady Catherine case since her disappearance 3 months ago. For the next 43 minutes, James Mitchell stood at his post with the envelope hidden in his jacket pocket. Every second felt like an hour. Every breath he took reminded him of the letter pressed against his ribs. Every time someone walked near the gate, he wondered if they might be connected to Lady Catherine's disappearance. James had been trained to notice details that other people missed. Now, with Lady Catherine's letter in his possession, he found himself remembering details from the security briefings that he had not thought about in weeks. He remembered that Lady Catherine had been acting strangely in the days before she disappeared. Her supervisor had mentioned that she seemed worried about something. She had been staying late at work more often than usual. She had been asking questions about security procedures that were not related to her normal job duties. James also remembered that Lady Catherine had special access to certain areas of the palace. As a senior personal assistant, she had security clearance that allowed her to go places that most palace employees could not go. She had access to private offices, personal apartments, and confidential documents. What if Lady Catherine had discovered something she was not supposed to know? What if she had seen or heard something that put her in danger? What if someone had threatened her to keep her quiet about what she had learned? James thought about the timing of her disappearance. It had happened just 2 weeks after a major security review at the palace. The security team had been investigating reports that some confidential information about the royal family had been leaked to newspaper reporters. They had been trying to figure out how private details about royal family members were appearing in tabloid newspapers. Could Lady Catherine's disappearance be connected to that investigation? Had she discovered who was leaking information to the newspapers? Had she found evidence that someone was betraying the royal family's trust? James remembered another detail from the security briefings. Lady Catherine's supervisor had mentioned that she had been asking questions about palace staff members who had access to certain types of information. She had been particularly interested in employees who had financial problems or who had connections to journalists and media companies. What if Lady Catherine had been conducting her own investigation? What if she had discovered who was responsible for the security leaks? And what if the person she discovered had found out that she knew their secret? That would explain why she had left so suddenly. If Lady Catherine had evidence that someone was betraying the royal family, and if that person had threatened her, she might have felt that she had no choice but to disappear. She might have been trying to protect herself until she could figure out a safe way to expose what she had discovered. James felt the envelope in his pocket again. If his theory was correct, this letter could contain the evidence that Lady Catherine had been gathering. It could contain the names of the people who were leaking royal family secrets to the newspapers. It could contain proof of who was responsible for one of the most serious security breaches in recent palace history. But James also realized that if his theory was correct, he might now be in danger too. If someone had been willing to threaten Lady Catherine to keep her quiet, they might be willing to threaten anyone else who got too close to the truth. James tried to push these worried thoughts out of his mind. He needed to focus on his immediate duty, which was to finish his shift without making any mistakes. But it was difficult to concentrate when he knew he was carrying something that could be incredibly important. At exactly 11:47 a.m., James saw his replacement approaching through the fog. Corporal David Walsh was a younger guard who had been working at the palace for only 8 months. David was a good soldier and a reliable guard, but James was not sure if he should trust him with information about Lady Catherine's letter. James had learned during his military training that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who appeared to be friends. If someone at the palace was involved in leaking information to newspapers, it could be anyone. It could be a guard, a secretary, a maintenance worker, or even a senior supervisor. Until James knew who could be trusted, he had to be very careful about who he told about the letter. David Walsh approached James's position and prepared to take over guard duty. The changing of the guard was a formal process that happened several times each day. David would stand at attention next to James for exactly 2 minutes, then James would march away and David would take his place. As David took his position, James noticed something that made him feel uneasy. David was wearing a new watch that looked very expensive. James knew that palace guards did not earn enough money to buy luxury watches unless they had income from somewhere else. James tried to remember if David had mentioned getting a new job or receiving money from his family, but he could not think of any explanation for why a young guard would suddenly have enough money to buy such an expensive watch. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the foggy weather. What if David was one of the people who was being Paid to leak information about the royal family? What if the expensive watch was a sign that he was receiving money from newspaper reporters in exchange for palace secrets? James realized that he could not trust anyone at the palace until he knew more about what was in Lady Catherine's letter. He needed to get the letter to someone who was definitely not involved in any security leaks. But who could he trust? As the 2-minute changing of the guard ceremony came to an end, James marched away from his post. His shift was over, and he was now free to leave the palace grounds. But instead of going to the guard break room as he normally would, James had a different plan. He needed to find a place where he could safely open Lady Catherine's letter and read what was inside. He needed to do this somewhere private, where no one from the palace could see him or interrupt him. And he needed to do it quickly, before anyone realized that he had taken the letter from the little girl. James walked quickly through the fog, toward the palace employee exit. As he walked, he thought about where he could go to safely examine the letter. His apartment was too far away, and he was worried that someone might be watching his home. The palace break rooms were not private enough, and he did not want other guards to see what he was doing. Then James remembered a small cafe about 3 blocks from the palace. It was a quiet place where palace employees sometimes went for coffee breaks. But on a foggy Saturday morning, it would probably be nearly empty. He could sit in a corner booth where no one could see what he was reading. As James reached the employee exit, he felt the envelope in his pocket one more time. In a few minutes, he would finally learn what Lady Catherine Pemberton had been trying to tell someone at the palace. He would finally understand why she had disappeared so suddenly 3 months ago, and he would finally discover whether his suspicions about security leaks and dangerous secrets were correct, or whether Lady Catherine's letter contained something completely different and unexpected. James walked quickly through the foggy streets toward the small cafe he had remembered. The fog was so thick that he could barely see the buildings around him, but he knew this part of London well. He had walked these streets many times during his 3 years as a palace guard. The cafe was called the Crown and Anchor, and it was owned by an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, who had once worked as a cook at the palace. Mr. Peterson was friendly to palace employees and often gave them discounts on coffee and sandwiches. More importantly, he was known for being discreet and not asking questions about palace business. When James reached the cafe, he was relieved to see that it was almost empty. The fog had kept most customers away, and only 2 people were sitting at tables near the front window. James chose a small booth in the back corner where he would not be easily seen from the street or from other tables. Mr. Peterson brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. "Nasty weather today, isn't it, James?" the old man said. "Not many people want to go out in this fog." "Perfect weather for staying inside with a hot drink," James replied, trying to sound normal despite the nervous energy he felt. After Mr. Peterson returned to the counter, James looked around to make sure no one was watching him. The 2 customers near the window were reading newspapers and drinking their coffee. They were not paying any attention to him. James slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Lady Catherine's envelope. Now that he could examine it closely, he could see even more details that had not been visible when the little girl was holding it. The envelope was made of very expensive paper, thick and cream-colored with a slight texture that felt smooth under his fingers. The handwriting was beautiful, written with what was definitely a high-quality fountain pen. The blue ink had a richness to it that showed it was not ordinary ballpoint pen ink. The red wax seal on the back was more elaborate than James had realized. It showed a coat of arms with a crown at the top, 2 lions on either side, and a banner at the bottom with words written in Latin. James recognized this as the seal of the Pemberton family, which was one of the oldest noble families in England. But what caught James's attention most was something he had not noticed before. The envelope felt strange in his hands. It was too light for what should be inside it, but it was also slightly thicker in one corner than in the others. There was definitely something inside besides just a letter. James carefully examined the edges of the envelope, looking for the best way to open it without damaging whatever was inside. The wax seal was still intact, which meant that no one had opened the envelope since Lady Catherine had sealed it. James would be the first person to read whatever message she had written. James took a deep breath and carefully broke the wax seal. The red wax cracked and fell away in small pieces. James was very careful to collect all the pieces because they might be important evidence later. He opened the envelope slowly and looked inside. There was indeed a folded letter written on the same expensive paper as the envelope. But there was also something else, a small, shiny object that was taped to the back of the letter. James pulled the letter out of the envelope and unfolded it carefully. The same beautiful handwriting covered both sides of the paper. But before he read the letter, James examined the small object that was attached to it. It was a key. A small silver key that looked like it might open a safety deposit box or a small safe. The key was attached to the letter with a piece of clear tape, and there was a small paper tag tied to it with a number written in Lady Catherine's handwriting. James felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was not just a letter. It was evidence. Lady Catherine had hidden something important, and this key was the way to find it. James looked around the cafe again to make sure no one was watching him, then began to read the letter. "To whoever finds this letter," it began. "My name is Catherine Pemberton, and I work as a personal assistant at Buckingham Palace. If you are reading this, it means that something has happened to prevent me from delivering this information safely, through normal channels." James felt a chill run down his spine. Lady Catherine had been expecting that something might happen, to her. She had planned for the possibility that she might not be able to deliver this information herself. The letter continued. "For the past 2 months, I have been investigating suspicious activities among certain palace staff members. I have discovered evidence that several employees have been selling private information about the royal family to newspaper reporters. This information includes personal details about family members, private conversations, and confidential schedule information." James gripped the letter tighter. His suspicions had been correct. Lady Catherine had discovered the source of the security leaks that had been worrying the palace security team. The people involved in this scheme include both junior staff members and at least one senior supervisor. They have been meeting secretly with journalists and receiving large payments for information. I have documented evidence of these meetings, including photographs, recorded conversations, and financial records. Lady Catherine's letter went on to name specific individuals who were involved in selling royal family secrets. James recognized some of the names. They were people he had worked with every day for 3 years. People he had trusted. People who had been betraying the royal family while pretending to be loyal employees. I became aware that the people involved in this scheme had discovered that I was investigating them. On Tuesday, June 15th, I received a threatening phone call warning me to stop asking questions or face serious consequences. The caller knew details about my investigation that proved he was connected to the group I had been watching. James realized that June 15th was the day before Lady Catherine had disappeared. She had received a threat and had realized she was in danger. "I have hidden all of my evidence in a safety deposit box at the London City Bank on Fleet Street. The key to this box is attached to this letter. The box number is written on the key tag. If something happens to me, please ensure that this evidence reaches someone in authority who can be trusted to act on it." James looked at the key again. The number on the tag was 247. This small piece of metal was the key to solving one of the biggest security problems the palace had faced in years. The letter ended with a final paragraph that made James's blood run cold. "I am leaving London tomorrow morning because I no longer believe I am safe here. I will try to find a secure location where I can stay hidden until this matter is resolved. I pray that this letter will somehow reach the right person who can help expose these traitors and protect the royal family from further harm. Catherine Pemberton, June 16th. James folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope along with the key. His hands were shaking slightly as he realized the full significance of what he was holding. Lady Catherine had risked her life to gather evidence against people who were betraying the royal family. She had been forced to disappear to protect herself from people who had threatened her. And now, 3 months later, her evidence had ended up in the hands of a palace guard who had the power to make sure justice was done. But James also realized that he was now in the same danger that had forced Lady Catherine to flee. If the people she had been investigating discovered that he had her evidence, they might threaten him too. He needed to act quickly and carefully to make sure the evidence reached the right people without putting himself at risk. James finished his coffee and left money on the table for Mr. Peterson. As he walked back out into the foggy London streets, he began to plan his next move. In his pocket, he carried the key to solving one of the most serious security breaches in palace history. But he also carried the knowledge that some of his colleagues were not who they appeared to be. James walked through the foggy streets toward Fleet Street, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He knew he needed to act quickly, but he also knew he needed to be very careful. The people Lady Catherine had been investigating were still working at the palace, and they might be watching for any signs that their secret had been discovered. Fleet Street was one of London's busiest areas, filled with banks, offices, and shops. The London City Bank was a large, old building with thick stone walls and heavy security. James had never been inside before, but he knew it was the kind of place where important people kept their most valuable possessions. When James reached the bank, he realized he had a problem. It was Saturday afternoon, and most banks were closed on weekends. But as he approached the front entrance, he saw a sign that said, "Safety Deposit Box Access Available Saturdays 9 a.m., 2 p.m. James looked at his watch. It was 12:30 p.m. He still had time to access Lady Catherine's safety deposit box, but he would need to hurry. Inside the bank, James approached the security desk. A stern-looking woman in a dark blue uniform asked him what he needed. "I need to access a safety deposit box," James said, trying to sound calm and confident. "Do you have your key and identification?" the woman asked. James showed her the key from Lady Catherine's letter. The woman examined it carefully, then checked a computer system to verify that it was a valid key for the bank. "Box number 247, she confirmed. "I'll need to see some identification, please." This was the moment James had been worried about. He was not Lady Catherine Pemberton, and he did not have permission to access her safety deposit box. But he also knew that the evidence inside that box was crucial for protecting the royal family. James made a decision that he hoped would work. He pulled out his palace security badge, which identified him as a member of the Royal Protection Service. "I'm here on official palace security business," he said quietly. "This safety deposit box contains evidence related to a serious security investigation. I've been authorized to retrieve its contents." The woman looked at his badge carefully, then looked at his face. James tried to project confidence and authority, even though his heart was beating very fast. "I'll need to call my supervisor," the woman said. James waited nervously while the woman made a phone call. He could not hear what she was saying, but he could see her looking at him several times during the conversation. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, she hung up the phone. "My supervisor says that palace security investigations take priority over normal banking procedures," she said. "I'll escort you to the safety deposit box area." James felt a wave of relief. His plan had worked, at least so far. The woman led him through several security doors and down a flight of stairs to a basement area filled with rows of small metal boxes. She used her master key along with Lady Catherine's key to open box number 247. "I'll give you some privacy to examine the contents," she said. "Please let me know when you're finished." After the woman left, James carefully opened the safety deposit box. Inside, he found exactly what Lady Catherine had promised in her letter: a collection of evidence that would expose the people who had been selling royal family secrets. There were dozens of photographs showing palace employees meeting with people who were obviously journalists or newspaper editors. The meetings were taking place in restaurants, parks, and other locations away from the palace. James recognized several of the palace employees in the photographs, including David Walsh, the guard who had replaced him that morning. There were also audio recordings on small digital devices. James listened to a few of them and heard palace employees giving detailed information about royal family schedules, personal conversations, and private activities. In exchange, the journalists were promising large cash payments. But the most shocking evidence was a list of bank account numbers and transaction records. Lady Catherine had somehow obtained proof that several palace employees had been receiving regular payments from newspaper companies. The amounts were substantial, enough money to explain how a junior guard like David Walsh could afford an expensive watch. James found records showing that the security leak had been going on for over a year. The people involved had sold information that led to embarrassing newspaper stories about royal family members. They had revealed private medical information, personal relationship details, and confidential travel plans. At the bottom of the box, James found a detailed report that Lady Catherine had written summarizing all of her findings. The report named 12 palace employees who were involved in the scheme, including guards, secretaries, maintenance staff, and one senior supervisor. The supervisor was someone James knew well, Commander Robert Harrison, who was responsible for coordinating palace security operations. Commander Harrison had access to the most sensitive information about royal family activities, and he had been selling that information to the highest bidders. James realized that this explained why Lady Catherine had not been able to report her findings through normal channels. Commander Harrison was the person she would normally have reported to about security concerns, but he was also one of the main people responsible for the security breaches. Lady Catherine had been trapped in an impossible situation. She had discovered evidence of serious crimes, but the person she was supposed to report to was one of the criminals. She had tried to gather enough evidence to go directly to higher authorities, but the criminals had discovered what she was doing and had threatened her. James carefully gathered all of the evidence and put it into a large envelope that was also in the safety deposit box. Lady Catherine had prepared everything perfectly, anticipating that someone else might need to retrieve her evidence and take action on it. As James left the bank with the evidence, he realized that he now faced the same problem that Lady Catherine had faced. How could he report what he had discovered when some of the people involved were in positions of authority at the palace? But James had an advantage that Lady Catherine had not had. He was a palace guard with direct access to the highest levels of palace security. He knew people who could be trusted to handle this evidence properly, and most importantly, he had proof of everything, proof that was too detailed and too extensive to be ignored or covered up. James walked through the foggy London streets toward his next destination, the home of Chief Inspector Margaret Thompson, who was responsible for investigating serious crimes involving royal family security. Inspector Thompson was someone James had met during security training, and he knew she could be trusted to handle the evidence properly. As James walked, he thought about Lady Catherine Pemberton, who had risked everything to protect the royal family from betrayal. Thanks to her courage and careful planning, and thanks to a curious 7-year-old girl who had found her letter, one of the most serious security breaches in palace history was about to be exposed. But James also knew that his work was just beginning. Exposing the criminals was only the first step. Now the authorities would need to arrest them, prosecute them, and figure out how to repair the damage they had done to royal family security. The fog was beginning to lift as James reached Inspector Thompson's neighborhood. For the first time in hours, he could see clearly ahead of him, and for the first time since the little girl had handed him Lady Catherine's letter, James felt confident that everything was going to work out exactly as it should. 6 months later, on a bright sunny Saturday morning in March, Emma woke up with the same excitement she had felt every Saturday for the past year. But today was different. Today, instead of asking her parents if they could go to the palace, she was getting ready for a very special invitation. A beautiful cream-colored envelope had arrived at their apartment 2 weeks earlier. It was addressed to Miss Emma Richardson and family, and had an official royal seal on the back. Inside was an invitation to a private tea ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Emma's parents had been amazed and confused when they first read the invitation. They could not understand why their 7-year-old daughter would be invited to the palace. The invitation did not explain the reason, but it was clearly official and very important. Emma remembered the foggy day when she had found the letter and given it to the palace guard. She had told her parents about it at the time, but they had thought it was just a normal piece of lost mail. They had not realized that their daughter's simple act of kindness would lead to something so extraordinary. Now, as Emma put on her best dress and her mother braided her hair extra carefully, she was more excited than she had ever been in her life. She was finally going to see inside the palace that she had been visiting from the outside for so many months. When Emma and her parents arrived at the palace gates, they were met by a familiar face. Sergeant James Mitchell, now wearing a new uniform with additional medals and insignia, was waiting to escort them personally. "Good morning, Emma," James said with a warm smile. "I've been looking forward to seeing you again." Emma's eyes grew wide. "You're the guard I gave the letter to. You look different without your big fuzzy hat." James laughed. "Yes, I am, and I want to thank you for what you did that day. You helped solve one of the most important cases in palace history." As James led Emma and her parents through the palace gates and into the beautiful gardens, he explained what had happened after Emma had given him the letter. "The letter you found was from a woman named Lady Catherine Pemberton," James said. "She had discovered that some people who worked at the palace were selling private information about the royal family to newspaper reporters. These people were betraying the trust of the royal family and putting their safety at risk." Emma listened carefully as James explained how Lady Catherine had gathered evidence against the people who were stealing secrets. She had been forced to disappear when they threatened her, but she had left behind proof of what they were doing. "The letter you found contained a key that led us to all of Lady Catherine's evidence," James continued. "Because of your honesty and kindness in returning that letter, we were able to arrest 12 people who were involved in stealing and selling royal family secrets." James told them that Commander Robert Harrison, who had been one of the most senior security officials at the palace, was now in prison for organizing the scheme. David Walsh and several other guards had also been arrested and would never work in security again. "But what happened to Lady Catherine?" Emma asked. "Is she safe now?" "Lady Catherine is perfectly safe," James said with a smile. "In fact, she's the person who wanted to meet you today. She's been waiting to thank the little girl who helped bring her evidence to the right people." James led them to a beautiful garden pavilion where a small tea party had been set up. Sitting at the table was an elegant woman with kind eyes and graying hair. When she saw Emma approaching, she stood up with tears in her eyes. "You must be Emma," Lady Catherine said, kneeling down so she was at Emma's eye level. "I am Catherine Pemberton. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for what you did." Emma felt shy meeting such an important person, but Lady Catherine's warm smile made her feel comfortable. "I just found your letter and thought someone should have it," Emma said simply. "It looked important." "It was very important," Lady Catherine said. "And because you returned it to the right person, you helped protect the royal family and catch some very bad people who were doing wrong things." As they sat down for tea, Lady Catherine explained to Emma and her parents what had happened during the 6 months since Emma had found the letter. "I had been hiding in Scotland, staying with my sister in a small village where no one would think to look for me," Lady Catherine said. "I was waiting for a safe way to get my evidence to people who could help. I had tried several times to get the letter to the palace, but I was afraid that the wrong people might intercept it." Lady Catherine explained that she had finally decided to leave the letter near the palace gates, hoping that an honest person would find it and turn it in to the guards. She had been watching from a distance that foggy morning when Emma found the envelope. "When I saw you pick up the letter and take it to the guard, I knew that my plan had worked perfectly," Lady Catherine said. "You were exactly the kind of honest, caring person I had hoped would find it." James explained that once he had delivered Lady Catherine's evidence to the proper authorities, everything had happened very quickly. Within a week, all 12 people involved in the scheme had been arrested. Bank accounts had been frozen, and all of the stolen information had been traced back to its sources. "The investigation is now complete," James said. "Lady Catherine has returned to her job at the palace, and new security procedures have been put in place to make sure nothing like this can happen again." Emma learned that James had been promoted to lieutenant for his role in exposing the security breach. He was now responsible for training new guards and making sure they understood the importance of protecting royal family privacy. As they enjoyed tea and small sandwiches and cakes, Lady Catherine gave Emma a special gift. It was a beautiful book about the history of Buckingham Palace, with pictures of all the rooms and gardens that Emma had only been able to imagine from outside the gates. "This book will help you learn about all the history and traditions of the palace," Lady Catherine said. "And whenever you read it, I want you to remember that you played an important part in protecting those traditions." At the end of their visit, James escorted Emma and her parents on a private tour of the palace gardens. Emma saw the beautiful rose garden, the lake where swans lived, and the long paths where members of the royal family took their daily walks. As they walked, Emma asked James a question that had been on her mind all day. "Do you think the guards still get lonely when they have to stand still for so long?" James smiled. "Sometimes we do get lonely, but now we know that there are people like you who care about us and want to help when we need it. That makes the job much easier." When it was time to leave, Lady Catherine gave Emma one final surprise. She handed her a special badge that identified her as an honorary friend of the palace. "This badge means that you will always be welcome here," Lady Catherine said. "And it means that you are someone the royal family knows they can trust and count on." As Emma and her parents walked home through the same London streets they had walked so many times before, Emma felt different. She was still the same curious 7-year-old girl who loved watching the palace guards, but now she knew that even small acts of kindness and honesty could lead to extraordinary adventures. Emma's simple decision to return a lost letter had helped solve one of the biggest mysteries in recent palace history. She had helped catch criminals who were betraying the royal family. She had helped a brave woman who had risked her life to do the right thing. And she had made friends with people who worked in one of the most famous buildings in the world. Most importantly, Emma had learned that being honest and helpful, even when no one was watching, was always the right thing to do. Sometimes the smallest actions by the most ordinary people could have the most extraordinary consequences. From that day forward, whenever Emma visited the palace gates on Saturday mornings, the guards would give her a small, subtle nod of recognition. And Emma would smile back, knowing that she would always be connected to the palace and its protectors in a very special way. The mysterious letter that had started as a simple act of childhood honesty had become the beginning of a lifelong friendship, and a story that Emma would treasure for the rest of her life.